Welcome to the course Critical Thinking Skills in Science. We're on Chapter 7, Western Science. This is session number 6, the last one. We have completed now building the whole house. We have gone through the foundation, the basic beliefs, the structure of the thinking system, the philosophy, the three methods of how to get to truth, how to get to reliable knowledge, the science model that's produced by these rules and methods, the resources available, the explanation of origins using those resources and the model, scientific model, explaining the origins of the universe, of man, of life and of man. Then we come to the conclusion up top, which is man concludes then that God does not exist. The supernatural does not exist. And that's a very important question that we need to deal with, because it has ramifications or consequences that are very dire for all of us. And that's where we come up with this question. The question of whether there exists a supernatural creator, a God, is one of the most important that we have to answer. I think that it is a scientific question. My answer is no. Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins admits that it is a very important question that we all need, and maybe the most important question that we need to answer. The question of whether there exists a supernatural creator, a God, is one of the most important that we have to answer. And how are we going to answer it? How am I going to answer it? How are you going to answer it? Dawkins answers it by saying, I think it's a scientific question. What's he mean by he thinks it's a scientific question? Does he mean that it's an answer that, or it's a science that answers it, but yet science is built on already having that answer? So how does science answer that question? I'm not sure how science answers a question like that when science is built on assumptions regarding that answer. And this is what, just to show it a little bit more, or to put it into one slide, we have number 14, which is the top of the house, the roof, the conclusion. Conclusion based on this model of science, the evolutionary model of science. Man concludes that the supernatural domain does not exist. Therefore, the Creator God cannot exist. And that's what Richard Dawkins concludes, that he thinks it's a scientific question on the existence of God, and since it's a scientific question, science answers no, God does not exist. So his answer is no. Therefore, the Creator God cannot exist. But if we look at that space in between, look at number 1, which is the foundation of the house. The foundation of the house is based on internal human reason logic as the source, closed system, natural elements only. So the foundation of the house really decides whether God exists or not. And science is third floor up, so it's not science that decides whether God exists or not. It's the assumptions at the base level of the house building that then forms a scientific paradigm. So this is where I believe that Richard Dawkins is trusting in science to provide the answer, when science is based on the belief system that holds it up, that gives its parameters to be able to even function. And so that's why it's already decided the question. Whereas number one is internal human reason logic as a source, closed system natural, which is based on the Western cultural tendency of the separate domains of natural and supernatural, pushing the supernatural out the door because it is outside the system. Even if it exists, it's outside the system and it has no influence within the system. So really the question has already been answered. Richard Dawkins doesn't have to refer to science really, because science, though, gives it authority, I guess, of being the correct answer, because science says God does not exist. But what is the scientific method? Can the scientific method test whether God exists or not? Well, the scientific method is based on human logic. It's based on empiricism, subjecting to testing, and it is number three, which is skepticism. And so it's kind of like you can't even submit God to scientific method of testing because he is a spirit. He is invisible. He is, but yet Romans says you can see God through that which has been created. So in other words, does it matter if there is reliable knowledge that is true but not justified? Well, then that's not counted. And that's what we had learned in the previous chapter, in that justified knowledge is knowledge that has gone through the scientific method and has been approved and justified as knowledge. But yet then also we learned about the half-life of knowledge, which is it expires, it's perishable. And in the medical field, it's anywhere from 15 months to 3 years. In the engineering field, it's maybe up to 5 years, 6 years, that the wisdom and the knowledge, reliable knowledge produced in those systems is perishable. In that in a few years, it may not even be true that what we had believed before. So in other words, what we're submitting to is that if we believe or not believe in God because of science, science is not in a position, is not equipped to answer that question, because science can only follow the rules that are under it within the building process. You change the rules and you change the science. And that's what the next chapter is about looking at a different science, because not everybody shares those same rules. Not everybody is in agreement with those rules. So if we change the rules, can we have a different science? And according to critical thinking, no. Because critical thinking is you have to maintain the rules, you have to maintain the consensus, you have to come to science and be willing to change your beliefs, have to change your outlook to be able to match the model of science that you're critically thinking about. So that's why it's kind of trying to balance critical thinking and say critical thinking is good. And it's kind of like we should think critically. Yes, we should in most cases. But if the case is that to critically think, we have to assume the same belief system and values as that science model, then I would say we are not to critically think in that way of absorbing or of exchanging belief systems, just to be within the consensus so that we're practicing science as consensus determines. Again, Richard Dawkins, he has been a source of a number of quotes that I have used. But here's Richard Dawkins again, and he's a biologist. And he says in his book, in the foreword, is that he says, I want to persuade the reader not just that the Darwinian worldview happens to be true, but that it is the only known theory that could in principle solve the mystery of our existence. Again, that's the use of worldview along with theory, meaning they're used in parallel, meaning that theory is being used as viewing, as a way of seeing things, as a pair of spectacles, as a grid of understanding and organizing the data. It's same as a Darwinian worldview. But what does that have to do with science? Why is Richard Dawkins promoting that he wants to persuade the reader not just that the Darwinian worldview is true, happens to be true, but that is the only known theory that could in principle solve the mystery of our existence? Because he knows that science, and his science that he's defending, is built on his belief system. And his belief system, at the bottom of it, is basic beliefs. It's a way to view the world. It's a belief system of how the world really is. What is reality like? And then using that belief system to organize and interpret the data, that is what he is saying. You have to adopt a Darwinian worldview. That's why he's saying it's important. Because if you adopt a Darwinian worldview, then you will automatically adopt his science. And you will not find anything wrong with his science. But if you don't adopt the Darwinian worldview, then you might find problems with the science. And then you are outside of critical thinking, because now you are thinking differently than what produced that science, that naturalistic evolutionary science. Again, just returning to Stephen Jay Gould's quote, and the glasses behind me. First facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. Theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them. Again, how do we perceive them? What is your belief system? Your belief system will produce a particular scientific model. And you are going to use that model to organize the data that you are observing. And so we become so convinced of it that it becomes a habit. We go around and we look at life and we experience life, and by habit, we interpret everything according to our culture, our prejudices, our theory, which forms then the habit of what the world actually is. I had read before an article that was quoted earlier in a different chapter on the deceptive mind. And it's kind of like our minds work according to the structures that we give it. And if we give it a good structure, then our mind will produce correct, reliable knowledge. If we give it an incorrect structure, then our mind is going to produce non-reliable knowledge. So how do we know that we're feeding our mind and giving it the correct structure to produce and to interpret by? Well, that depends on who we trust and what we trust. Do we trust human intuition? Do we trust human logic? Do we trust human senses, empiricism? Or do we trust an external source that claims to know the truth and to have the truth, a truth that never changes, a truth that is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Or do we settle for a truth that has a half-life of anything from 17 months to 5 to 6 years? That's the choices we make. And we choose who we believe, what to believe, and what model that we put into practice. Thanks again for joining me. This is the end. This is the last session, wrapping up Chapter 7, Western Science. The next chapter is going to be on a non-Western science, assuming different belief system that upholds the whole structure, that influences what it produces as a scientific model. Thank you again. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. Again, you're welcome to communicate with us through the addresses on the board. But thanks again, and hope to see you in the next chapter.